Have you been to a baptism lately? Have you been to a funeral lately? And if so, have you noticed the connections between the two liturgies in terms of the symbols which are used? There are three. Firstly, in baptism, the person is baptized in water. At a funeral, the person is sprinkled with holy water as a sign of and reminder of their baptism. Secondly, at baptism, the person is clothed in white and told they become a new creation in Christ. At the funeral, the person is again dressed in white as the white pall is laid over the coffin. And thirdly, at baptism, a candle is lit for the newly baptized person from the paschal candle. And at a funeral, the paschal candle is again lit. So why these three connections? Why this close connection of baptism and funeral in our Catholic rites? Well, it comes from the second reading which we hear this weekend at Mass from Romans chapter 6, which is a really important passage in our understanding of the meaning of baptism. Because we hear St. Paul tells us that when you are baptized into Christ's death, which sounds like a very stark thing to say, something we don't tend to want to say much at baptisms, which are usually filled with joyful, happy babies. But this is really central to our Catholic understanding. When you are baptized into Christ's death. Now, this is not just a throwaway line that Paul kind of says accidentally. He goes on to say, you went into the tomb with him. Now, why is St. Paul saying this? Well, St. Paul is saying that baptism is our connection with Jesus Christ. It is a permanent connection into Jesus' death and his resurrection. Now, obviously, it's not a literal death. It's not that when we are baptized, we die, obviously. So what kind of death are we talking about here? St. Paul goes on to say that it's a death to sin, that Christ died to sin, and therefore you must consider yourself dead to sin and alive to Christ. So let's explore that a little bit. What does it mean that we should be dead to sin? Why even use such kind of bleak and stark language, which is not really the kind of language we maybe would like to use, but we actually need to recognize it and claim it because it is so important. If we look around the world, we have to say we can see the effects of sin around us in big and small ways. Think of the awful things like invasions and wars. At the grand macro scale, there is sin working in the world. Think more locally and smaller scales. Think of things like all the phone scams that we are now so alert to and maybe many of us have experienced, which are obviously the sinful effects of people who are struggling to get ahead. And in so many ways, big and small, we see sin at work in the world. It was the great promise of the last 200 years, perhaps, that science and technology would progress and we would overcome all human problems. But in fact, we can see very obviously the opposite's happened. That the more technology, the more prosperity we have, often the more sin abounds in all kinds of very unfortunate ways. So science and technology are not going to be the answer, but the overcoming of human sin. Even though there is much good in technology that we should be able to make the best of, something different is needed, a different kind of problem to sin, a different solution to the problem of sin. And the solution is the spiritual one. It is the power of Jesus' death and resurrection. That Jesus' death on the cross is both the payment for the penalty of all sin, but it's also the power to overcome sin, sinfulness, which is not just individual sins, it's kind of our human nature. That we know that, left to our own devices, we are always drawn to selfishness. There's something in us a bit innate. Even though we are good and made in the image of God, we're still drawn to sinful ways. In fact, all the things we label as the 7 deadly sins, the anger and pride and greed and other things, they tend to be the things which we are drawn to naturally. So we need a supernatural thing to help us overcome what we are naturally drawn to. And that is the power of Jesus' death and resurrection, which our baptism begins to connect us to. Now, people who are baptized adults sometimes say they feel like a new person. They can feel the difference going on in them. For most of us, though, this baptism happened when we were still babies or very young. We didn't notice. But the idea is a bit like a vaccination that takes place in childhood. It's meant to prevent a future harm. It's meant to, just as a vaccination gives us antibodies to help fight against a certain infection, so too our baptism is meant to give us the strength to connect us to Jesus so that Jesus' power helps to overcome that orientation towards sinfulness. Now we know that even when we're baptized, we still sin, so we need to continually seek more and more of God's help. That's what the Eucharist is, in fact, that the Eucharist is our renewing of our immersion into Jesus' death and resurrection. And we're going to explore further next week when we hear Romans chapter 8, another really important chapter of Romans that speaks about not just the orientation towards Christ and away from sin, but the power Jesus gives, the power God gives through the Spirit to help us overcome. And it is for us the constant renewing of ourselves in the Spirit, the constant reaching out to God and asking God's help that actually becomes, in the end, the antidote, the supernatural solution to our natural attraction to sin. So for this week, let's recognize our dignity, the dignity which we are given as symbolized in the white garment of baptism, that we become a new creation. We who are baptized, we are immersed into the power of Jesus' death and resurrection. Something we could not do for ourselves, but a gift God gives us freely. A new dignity beyond our human dignity that is innate to being human, a supernatural dignity given to us by our connection to Jesus in his death and his resurrection.